For our apologetic question this week, we are going to deal with a most important and most challenging one, perhaps over all the other apologetic issues we have looked at. And this is the question we're going to look at today. How do we as Christians defend the problem of evil and suffering in our world? That's a prevalent question that especially the critics, the skeptics of Christianity have. How do we explain evil and suffering if there is a God? What's our justification? How do we defend the fact that there is evil and suffering in this world? And to me, this really is the toughest question in the theological world. It's that question of why. Why do bad things happen to people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen, especially to God's people? It really is theology's toughest question. And you know what? It's also life's toughest question as well. And there's the question, why does God allow so much suffering? I think at times we can understand why there is some suffering and evil in this world, and we're going to look at some of those reasons together this week. But maybe the real question is, why does God allow so much suffering in this world? At times, doesn't it seem like the problem of evil and suffering is kind of an overkill? It's not just the fact of evil and suffering, it's the fact that there is so much suffering. And you know what? This is a global issue. How do we explain global natural catastrophes like floods and tsunamis and earthquakes and tornadoes where innocent people are killed, um, lives are destroyed? How do we explain evil and suffering on a global scale? And it's also a very practical pastoral issue. In my 25 years as a pastor, I can't tell you how many times this question was posed to me from some of my church members. Maybe they lost a loved one. Maybe they're going through a terrible ongoing illness and they're wondering why. Why am I suffering? Why did God allow this to happen to me? Why did God allow this to happen to my loved ones? And you know what? To bring it down home in your own life, the problem of evil and suffering is also a very personal issue. And no doubt all of you that are watching and listening to my voice right now, you have personally walked through that valley of evil and suffering yourself. Maybe it's been problems or pain, suffering in your own life. Maybe it's been issues with loved ones that are around you. The problem of evil and suffering, this isn't just abstract and theoretical, it's not just theological, it's also global, it's pastoral, it's very personal. I have a picture here on the screen. You can see kind of a facetious image here of the heavens. You got God up here on the throne, and you have an angel there next to God. And look down below there, you see this huge tsunami that's about to totally destroy this city. And the angel looks at God and says, God, have you ever considered maybe just revising your plan a little bit? Is this really necessary? Are these kind of tragedies really a part of your plan? I think that's a pretty important question. And let's see if we can come up with some answers to that. And here's the real problem we face as Christians. How do we reconcile these three things? How do we reconcile the goodness and the love of God with the power of God? We know that God is all powerful. We know that God is all good. He's all loving. So, how do we reconcile those two with that third problem we confront? And that's the reality of the existence of evil in our world. So, what options do we have? Well, there we go. There are the three choices we have to deal with. We have the power of God, the goodness, the love of God, the reality of evil in this world. Well, we certainly can't dismiss the power of God. We can't say God is not all powerful. Then we're we're undercutting the very nature of who God is. He is all powerful. So we can't choose that option. And we certainly can't diminish or downplay or deny the goodness and the love of God. Again, this goes right to the very heart, the very core of who God is. He is all good, He is all loving. So we can't say God's not all powerful. We can't say God is not all loving. He's not all good. Well, maybe then we can just deny the reality of evil in this world. Well, we know that's not really an option. We all know evil is real. So there's the dilemma we face as Christians. How do we reconcile these three things without eliminating one, two, or three of these? Well, let's look toward a biblical answer. And I call this working toward a biblical answer. I just don't think in our lifetimes, with our finite human minds, we're ever going to be able to perfectly figure out the reason for every single occurrence of evil and suffering in the world or in our lives or in the life of someone that we know. So we're not going to get black and white conclusive answers, but you know what? We can turn to the Bible and we can work toward some kind of a resolution, some kind of a biblical answer. And before I get into some important biblical principles, let me state this. Here's an important preliminary fact to keep in mind when we address the tough topics in life like this. And I'll say this up front. There is an element of mystery behind these kind of life difficult questions, evil and suffering. Sometimes we're going to have to acknowledge what God says there in Isaiah chapter 55. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I think God is giving us a word of warning there. Let's be careful about thinking that we can perfectly figure out the mind and the will and the ways of God. We're just not going to be able to do that. And if anything, that ought to give us a word of warning that we need to exercise a little humility, a little holy humility as we try to look for answers to some of these difficult questions. Like, why is there evil and suffering in this world? So let's look at, let me give you 5 or 6 basic biblical principles as we work toward some kind of an answer there to this very prevalent question. Well, let's start at the beginning. Good place to start here. We can go back to the beginning of when God created us as humans. What do we see? We go back to the book of Genesis. God did not create evil. In fact, after each of God's creative days that we read there in the book of Genesis, what does God conclude? After each day, God says, it was good. It was good. It was good. And then he creates humans, Adam and Eve. And now it's not just good. He says, this is very good. So we conclude there that at the beginning, when God created, there was no evil. Everything was good. So here's the wrong argument when it comes to this issue of evil and suffering. The wrong argument would run something like this. God created all things. Evil is a thing. Therefore, God created evil. No, that's the wrong argument. The right argument would go something like this. All things God created are good. And that's exactly what we read in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. All things God created are good. Evil isn't good, obviously. Therefore, the argument goes like this. God he couldn't have created evil. So there's an important starting point. God did not create evil. But what did God create? Well, he created moral agents with this wonderful gift of free will and free choice. And we can go back there to the heavenlies there and the angels. We read about this cataclysmic event of the fall of Lucifer, and you see a picture there of Lucifer falling from heaven, with along with a third of the angels who rebelled against God. Remember, Lucifer's basic issue was he wanted to be like God, and because of that, he was cast out of heaven. You see Lucifer saying there, "Well, that didn't go the way I hoped." And no, it didn't go the way that he hoped. So God created angels apparently at the beginning. They were good, but he created them with the gift of free will, and they chose to disobey and misuse that gift of free will, and they sinned and were cast out of heaven. And then we get to the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, and now Lucifer shows up there in the form of the serpent there and tempts Adam and Eve and says, if you don't really have to not eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God warned them, don't eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day you eat, you will surely die. And Satan says, did God really say that? And you know what? You can be like God. Wasn't that Lucifer's basic problem there in the heavens? He wanted to be like God. Same temptation there to Adam and Eve. Hey, go ahead, eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and guess what? You'll be like God. You'll know all about evil. You'll be just like God. And so they give in to that temptation and they sin. And now we see evil entering into this world. God didn't create it. In essence, we might say Adam and Eve created evil in their misuse of free will, just like Lucifer and those fallen angels misused their free will. I like this from Norman Geisler, one of our great Christian apologists. He said this: God created the fact of freedom. We, as humans, we perform the acts of freedom. He made evil possible. Men made evil actual. And isn't that an important conclusion there? Yeah, God created freedom, but it's people who chose to do what they would do with that freedom. Yeah, it was a possibility that people would abuse that free will, abuse that freedom of choice. There would be the possibility of evil, but guess what? Who takes the blame for evil in this world? Not God. It's people who made evil actual. And you might say, why did God create it this way? Well, the fact is, this is absolutely the best possible kind of world that God had created. He created us with free will. God wanted us to be in a love relationship with him. And by definition, a love relationship doesn't have to be voluntary. God said, you know what? I'm going to create these humans and I'm going to give them the choice whether they want to be in a love relationship with me. I'm not going to force them. I'm not going to make them puppets or a bunch of mannequins or a bunch of robots to just obey me. No, by definition, love has to be a mutual, voluntary kind of a thing. And wow, if God would have created the world in any other way, it would absolutely not have been the best possible world. So God did not create evil, but God created moral agents, and that's angels and us. He created us with this gift of free will. And it really couldn't have been any other way. And thank God that we have that gift of free will. We're not forced, we're not coerced into being in a relationship with God. We can choose it, we can reject it, or we can accept it. That's because of the wonderful gift of free will. So, what happened here as a result of Adam and Eve's rejection of God, their wanting to be like God, their misuse of their free will? Now we see evil entering this world, and two different kinds of evil. Moral evil, yeah, that's the direct result of bad choices and bad decisions that people make. They misuse that free will, and there are consequences. Um, Somebody smokes their whole life, they get lung cancer. They can't blame God for that. That was their bad choice. Somebody drinks, they get drunk, they get behind the wheel of a car, they have a wreck, they kill somebody. Can't blame God on that. That's moral evil. But also, this shows you how cataclysmic the fall of Adam and Eve was. And when sin entered this world, it didn't just affect them, it didn't just affect the whole human race, it affected the whole cosmic order. And as a result of the fall of Adam and Eve, natural evil comes into this world. So, yeah, that's how we would explain natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes. That's just a part of a fallen world that resulted because of Adam and Eve's sin. Yeah, Paul hit it on the head here in Romans 8:22. He says they're all creation groans. The groaning of creation. Isn't that exactly what we see in our world today? Creation groans, awaiting the return of Jesus when he's going to make everything right again in a brand new heaven and new earth. That's where we're headed. In the meantime, the natural order is broken. All creation groans. A third principle as we work toward a biblical understanding of evil and suffering. We have to be very careful in how we define good and bad. Think about this. We love to quote Romans 8:28. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Yeah, we love that verse. I certainly believe that verse. God is at work in everything good, bad, and ugly that happens to us. He's working for our good. But the question is, what is the good that Paul is writing about here? What is God working the good for? Well, you got to look at the next verse, Romans 8:28. Here's God's purpose of saving us. Here's the purpose of salvation. It's not just to get us into heaven one day. Paul says here, here's what God is up to. Here's how God is working in our lives. He's working to conform us to the image of his son. In other words, God's purpose for us is to become more and more like Jesus, to grow in becoming like Christ. So God's ultimate good, God's ultimate plan for us, listen, it's not to make us happy. No, God's ultimate goal for your life is to make you holy. And what does it mean to be holy? It means to be like Jesus, to grow in becoming more and more like Jesus. Just what Paul writes there in Romans 8:29. So God's ultimate good plan is that he wants to conform us to the image of his son. So that leads me to the next question. How does God do that? How is God working all things together for our ultimate good, which is becoming like Jesus? Well, here's where God can use suffering and pain and adversity and trials and tribulations in our lives to work toward that ultimate goal that he has for our lives. Sometimes God will use pain and suffering, adversity to maybe turn us. Maybe God's got to get our attention. Maybe we're heading the wrong direction. He wants to get us back in line with him, back into his plan. I love what C.S. Lewis said here. Pain insists upon being attended to. Isn't that true? God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our consciences. But he shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So sometimes God's going to allow some bad things to happen, maybe to get our attention, maybe to get people's attentions, yeah, to turn us. Secondly, maybe God brings these things into our lives as a part of his sovereign plan to test us, maybe to make us stronger, to grow us up, to make us more mature. Sometimes God allows these things to happen to us, some pain and suffering. Maybe he's trying to teach us something. I think about Paul's thorn in the flesh. Remember, he had this thorn in the flesh. He prayed about it. He prayed about it 3 times. He asked God to take it away. God didn't take it away. But what did God do instead? God taught Paul some amazing lessons about grace and how God is all sufficient, and how when Paul is weak, then he becomes strong because God takes over. Yeah, sometimes pain and suffering we go through Maybe God's trying to teach us something. Maybe He's trying to train us, getting us ready for something better, the next great stage in His plan for our lives. Ultimately, here's what God is at work. He's trying to completely conform us to the image of His Son. He's trying to transform us. He's getting us ready for heaven one day. We're not quite ready yet. We're not completely like Jesus. We haven't been completely conformed to His image. So maybe God is using adversities, trials, tribulations, pain, suffering. Maybe a part of the reason is God's ultimately getting us ready for heaven one day. He's going to complete that confirmation, that conforming process, that transformation process. A fourth principle we see in the Bible, very important. Right now, down here in this world, we don't see the big picture, do we? We don't see that ultimate plan that God is working towards in our lives, or that ultimate plan that God is working out in history. Again, Romans 8:28. Notice what it says. All things doesn't say instantly are going to be good. No, they're going to work together eventually for our good. And you know what? That may take time. We may not realize all that right now, even in this lifetime. Like Romans 8:18, our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. Yeah, one day when we're in heaven, we'll be able to look back and we'll see the rhyme and the reason for everything that we went through in life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But you know what? At that moment, and only at that moment, we'll be able to look back and see that, wow, the sufferings, the pains, the trials that we went through in this world, they're just going to be swallowed up in the grandeur and the glory of being there in the presence of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 13:12, here's a good word of warning. Paul says, now, right now, we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. We don't see things clearly right now. We hard to make sense of evil and suffering and these kind of tough questions in life. But what does he say? Then, when's then? Well, that's in heaven. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Isn't that true? Then in heaven I shall know fully. So right now we don't see the big picture. I think we can be working towards that, and that's why it's important that we read the Bible, we study the Bible. We're starting to allow God to transform our minds. We're starting to get more and more of the mind of Christ as we are being conformed to His image. We can start working toward seeing the bigger picture, but ultimately that's never going to happen until we are in heaven with the Lord. Number 5, very important principle. Good news here. There is evil and suffering in this world. We can't deny it. We can't bury our heads in the sand. Evil and suffering is real right now. But one day, all sin and evil will be dealt with, will be judged once and for all. Well, how do we know that? How can we as Christians claim that? Well, good news is we get to read about the end of the story, and we can look at the book of Revelation, and we can see where all this is headed. We can see where God's ultimate plan will one day come to a culmination there with the return of Jesus. And here's what we see there. This is heaven, folks. This is there. We're in our final home, in that final heaven right back here on a redeemed, restored earth, a new heaven back here on a new earth. And now, what does God promise? He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more. What a great promise. It's not just a promise, it's a fact. Here's where we're headed. We're going to be with the Lord in a place where there'll be no more of this bad stuff forever. And here's another one of my favorite books, When Skeptics Ask, by Geisler Books. Here's how the argument should really go. If God is all good, He will defeat evil. If God is all powerful, he can defeat evil. Evil is not yet defeated, but therefore we know God can and will one day defeat evil. And there's our hope, friends. There's what we can hang on to. Where are we headed? It's the day when God will defeat evil and suffering and pain and death once and for all. So, suffering, it's never easy for us. Can't deny that. It hurts. It's, we might say, a pretty bitter pill to swallow. But here's the sixth principle, and we can look at God Himself. Ultimately, think about this: God took His own medicine. We might say the crucial answer to the problem of evil and suffering. Think about this. We talk about the crux of something, the crux of the matter. What's the real heart? What's the real issue here? The crucial answer, the crux of the matter. Think about the word crucial. This is interesting. The English word crucial derives from the Latin word crux. So what's the crux of the matter? The cross. How profound is that? The crucial matter, the crux of the matter, is the cross of Jesus. And why do I say that? What do we see when we look at the cross of Jesus? Uh, don't we see that God knows all about suffering? Good grief. God Himself in the flesh, there on the cross, went through the most excruciating kind of pain and suffering that we could not even imagine. Hanging there on the cross for what, 6 hours, a slow, painful death. Does God know about suffering? You bet. Does Jesus know about suffering? You bet. Did Jesus suffer unjustly? Sure. Was Jesus rejected by people? Did He know about relational issues? Did He know about rejection and pain and suffering, even though He didn't deserve it? Those are the questions we often ask. Jesus identified with all of that completely. So think about the cross. How significant is this? And here's what God did there on the cross. God took that ultimate instrument of sin and evil and suffering, and what did He do? He redeemed it and He transformed it into the ultimate instrument of our good. Isn't that profound? Yeah, the horrible, painful death of Jesus accomplished the greatest good for us, our salvation. And you know what? If God could take a cross and transform that into something for our good and His glory, guess what? He can take whatever sin, whatever evil, whatever suffering we encounter in life, and guess what? God can take those bad things, He can work them together for good. He can redeem them, He can transform them for our ultimate good, becoming like Jesus, and for His glory. Many of you have heard about Joni Eareckson Tada. She's got an amazing testimony. She's actually spoken at DBU a couple of times in the last 10 years or so. She has a really tragic testimony. When she was a teenager, she had a diving incident and she ended up fracture of between the fourth and fifth cervical vertebrae. She became a quadriplegic. She was paralyzed from the shoulders down, really, even to this day. But what did she see? She was a Christian and she struggled with what happened to her. Bad thing, evil and suffering. But what was her perspective on evil and suffering? Well, I've heard Joni share this testimony, and she goes back to the cross. And she said, just what we've been talking about, if God could take this instrument of evil and suffering, if God can redeem and transform that ultimate instrument of evil into something good, Here's Johnny Erickson Tata now in a wheelchair. Is that not one of the prime symbols of evil and suffering in our world? And Johnny says this: if God can transform the cross, that cruel instrument of suffering, God can redeem and transform this instrument of evil into something good. And during her 2 years of rehabilitation, she experienced anger, depression, suicidal thoughts, religious doubts. She struggled with this problem of evil and suffering that happened in her life. However, she transformed it into something good, or she allowed God to transform it into something good. She learned to paint with a brush between her teeth. She's painted some amazing pieces of art with a paintbrush in her teeth. She began to write, and she's now written over 40 books. She's an amazing singer. She's recorded several musical albums. She's even starred in an autobiographical movie of her life. She is now one of the #1 leading advocates for disabled people in America today. Wow, how God transformed a tragedy into something good in her life. And she'll share, looking back, she could never have had the influence that she has today. Her testimony, her speaking in churches and even to government officials, the influence that she has in the world today, it would never have been the same if God didn't allow her transform a terrible tragedy in her life. And I love that story from Johnny Erickson Tata. All right, last word I'll say about this problem of evil and suffering. Again, we got to be careful. The element of mystery. We'll never perfectly figure out why things happen. Certain things happen. Why is there evil and suffering? There are some things that we just aren't going to have foolproof, airtight answers for. In fact, I think we have to be careful as Christians when we're talking with people who've gone through tragedies and they're experiencing evil and suffering. I think we got to be real careful about coming up with simplistic answers to difficult questions in life like this. Yeah, beware of those who quickly give easy answers to difficult questions. I think we have to be real careful about that. How about this? There are times God doesn't give us easy answers. We wish He would sometimes, but He just doesn't do it that way. But you know what? Better than simplistic, easy answers, God gives us something even better. He gives us Himself. And here's one of my favorite paintings. You can see this guy obviously going through a really tough time, some pain and suffering. He's about ready to give up. But who is there holding him up? It's the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ. So here's a guy who maybe didn't get the easy answers he would have liked to have about the difficult times that he was going through. But you know what? He could rest assured and he could rest in knowing that the arms of Jesus were there with him and for him and in him. And because of that, God would get him through that valley of evil and suffering. Well, I hope that was a helpful lesson for you. That's one of my favorites. And I really believe that this is a question we need to be prepared to give an answer for, because this absolutely is probably the #1 issue, #1 problem that critics and skeptics of Christianity are going to throw in our face. If you believe, Christians, in an all-loving, all-good, all-powerful God, how do you explain evil and suffering in this world? And I think these 6 biblical principles are a big part of our apologetic, our defense for that issue. Hope you have a great week. We're getting close to Resurrection Day. We're getting close to the Good Friday and the resurrection. I think all this will come together as we get into a good study about the resurrection here in a week or so. In the meantime, God bless you. And I know many of you are walking through some difficult times in your life right now, you've got some evil and suffering, some pain, some adversity in your life, just want to encourage you to hang in there. Uh, Jesus is there behind you and before you, and he is with you. And again, better than getting easy answers, you get Jesus himself to walk with you every step of your journey in life. God bless you. We'll see you back next week. Have a great week.